Someone may go missing for many reasons. A disappearance may be voluntary, fueled by the desire to get away and start a new life elsewhere. It may be accidental, something having gone terribly wrong without anyone knowing. Or it may be the result of horrific criminal activity. The status of the missing person can remain unclear for many years. In some cases, a disappearance can go without explanation for much longer, and sometimes, just sometimes, the proposed theories for why a disappearance happened and remains unsolved goes beyond the earthly and into the paranormal. Sometimes people disappear mysteriously, leaving no trace behind. In very rare instances, they disappear and yet at the same time seem to remain, as if trapped somewhere just out of sight. Such was the case of Charles Ashmore, a 16-year-old from Quincy, Illinois. One cold evening in November 1878, it is said he stepped outside of his family's home to fetch water from the well. When he did not return, his father and sister, fearing that something had happened to him, went outside, lanterns in hand, to search for him. Snow was freshly fallen, and so they were able to follow his footsteps as they led away from the house. Roughly halfway to the well, however, they stopped abruptly. The footprints simply ended, without any sign of a slip or struggle. Fearful for Charles's safety, they rushed to the well to see if he had somehow fallen in. He had not, with the ice on the surface being so thick that it must have been like that, undisturbed for several hours. Charles was nowhere to be seen. Dumbfounded by the disappearance, his father and sister returned to the house and conveyed the mystery to Charles's mother. As expected, she was distraught and would not rest, pacing the house searching for clues as to the whereabouts of her missing boy. She did this for several days. On the fourth day, as she stood by the well, it is claimed that she heard Charles's voice calling out to her. She could not see him, and so immediately responded by asking her son to reveal himself, to tell her where he was. His voice was clear, and yet seemed to come from different directions. Although she continued to be able to hear him, he did not tell her where he was. This strangeness is said to have continued for several months, with family members and neighbours all able to hear Charles's voice. Still, however, he could not be seen, with no one being able to offer an explanation as to where his voice was coming from. Over time, Charles's calls grew fainter and seemed to be coming from a greater distance, always in an unidentifiable direction. By midsummer, he was entirely inaudible, his calls having faded to nothing. Tragically, Charles was never seen or heard again. A similar case is said to have occurred some 30 years later, on Christmas Eve 1909, when an 11-year-old boy called Oliver Thomas also disappeared on his way to fetch water from his family's well. It was around 11 p.m. in the Welsh county of Powys, and the Thomas family were enjoying their festive celebrations, when the head of the family, Mr. Thomas, sent his son to get some more water from the well. Oliver put on his boots and overcoat, took the bucket, and headed outside. It is said that almost as soon as he walked out the door, Oliver started screaming. Grabbing lanterns, the family rushed outside, supposedly just in time to hear the boy shout, "They've got me! They've got me!" Believing his voice was coming from above them, everyone flashed their lanterns to the sky, but could see nothing other than the black, starless night. According to a 1966 reportage on the earlier event, Oliver kept screaming as his family frantically searched for him, his voice growing fainter and fainter until it faded away altogether. Trying to retrace Oliver's footsteps did not help. The snow was fresh and deep, and so it was easy to track his movements from the house. As expected, they headed towards the well, but then stopped suddenly, as in the case of Charles Ashmore. It is said that the wooden bucket was found about 15 feet away from the last footprint in the snow. The following day, Oliver still missing, police arrived at the farmhouse. A search party was organised and the countryside scoured. The well on the property was also searched, being probed with grappling hooks to see if the boy had fallen in. Faced with a lack of evidence, foul play was the only explanation the police could think of, and so all who had attended the party the following evening were interrogated. And yet, there was still no explanation. The boy had simply vanished, seemingly upward, away into the night sky. The similarity between these two stories, boys being snatched from the snow on their way to the well, their voices lingering after their disappearances, has led some to question whether they met a similar fate, with one possible theory being that they were taken by a large aerial predator of some variety. And yet, what manner of bird would be capable of lifting an 11-year-old boy, carrying him away across the sky, let alone a presumably significantly heavier 16-year-old? One of the more ridiculous terrestrial theories involves kidnapping balloonists. In regards to explanations of an otherworldly variety, some have suggested that extraterrestrials may have been responsible for Charles and Oliver's disappearances. Another supernatural theory is that the boys were somehow spirited away to another plane of reality, maliciously snatched by interdimensional beings, trapped in a different dimension from which their voices were able to, for a limited time, seep out from. Whatever the case may be, both boys' disappearances remain a mystery to this day. Joe LaBelle was no stranger to the harsh northern climate of Canada's Nunavut territory. A fur trapper who had spent many a winter in the isolated and largely uninhabited lands of northern Canada, it was not unusual for him to seek shelter at the infrequent indigenous settlements in the area. On one particularly bitter night in November 1930, LaBelle supposedly decided to stop at a small Inuit village located on the shores of Lake Anjikuni. He is said to have visited the settlement previously, with the villagers known for being friendly, welcoming trappers and traders in the past. Around 30 men, women and children called the village home, and being situated on a lake, it was a bountiful atmospheric oasis in a desert of ice and snow. And yet, as LaBelle trudged through the snow towards the village, it was obvious there was something terribly wrong. Upon entering the settlement, LaBelle was greeted by silence. Looking for the villagers, he found a fire, still smoking, with fresh stew cooking over it, but no person there to tend the flames. The dwellings were all empty, with weapons and personal belongings still in place. The storehouse was full of trout, and unfinished shirts in the midst of being made still had needles in them. LaBelle searched the entire settlement, but there was simply no trace of the villagers, with it being clear that the village had been abandoned in a hurry, and yet the only footprints in the snow were his own. Unsettled, and despite the promise of food and shelter, LaBelle could not bring himself to stay in the deserted village, and so continued onward to the nearest telegraph office. From there he sent a message to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, requesting help. When they arrived, a thorough search of the village was conducted. Not only were they able to confirm LaBelle's strange account, they are said to have made some startling discoveries of their own. On the outskirts of the village, in the burial grounds, they found that every single grave had been opened and were now empty. It could not have been the work of animals, for the ground was frozen solid, meaning tools would have been required to unearth the bodies. Not only that, the stones circling the graves were undisturbed. Grave desecration was a heinous taboo, and it was difficult to believe that the villagers had dug up their beloved dead, and yet it had clearly been done by someone. In addition to the empty graves, a pack of 7 sled dogs was found, buried under 12 feet of snow, having died from starvation. With the village fully stocked with food only a few meters away, there was no explanation for why the animals had perished. Not only that, how they managed to waste away so quickly when it was apparent the village had been abandoned only hours before LaBelle's initial arrival was unknown. The reasons for the abandonment and the mass grave desecration were not discovered, and neither were the villagers. As far as the mounted police could tell, they had vanished into thin air. To make matters even stranger, on their way to meet LaBelle at the village, the RCMP had supposedly encountered yet another peculiar tale. When they asked a trapper by the name of Armand Laurent if he had seen anything strange in the area, he is said to have told them that he and his sons had witnessed a mysterious gleaming object in the sky just a few days earlier. It had, he claimed, changed shape before his very eyes, before travelling across the sky in the direction of the lake. Whilst investigating the village and Lake Anjikuni, it is claimed that the RCMP also witnessed strange lights in the sky. Quite unlike the northern lights which were visible in the area, the lights that the RCMP are said to have seen were unnatural. Bright, almost fluorescent blue and pulsing, they were not at all the same as the natural wonder they were used to seeing. Just like the state of the abandoned village, the lights could not be explained. As with all cases of the inexplicable, in the decades since the mass disappearance was alleged to have occurred, there have been attempts to explain the happening. The first press account of the mysterious incident can be found in the Le Pas newspaper of Manitoba, printed in November 1930 and reported upon by journalist Emmett E. Keller. Shortly afterwards, on the 27th of November, the story was reprinted by an American newspaper, Virginia's Danville Bee. After that, the story circulated countless newspapers across the continent, before eventually fading from common consciousness. The case was resurrected in 1959 by American writer and broadcaster Frank Edwards in his book Stranger Than Science. After that, the story took on a life of its own, with all manner of details being added and embellished, so much so that it was claimed thousands of Inuits had gone missing instead of the 25 to 30 people originally reported. And so many have been eager to debunk and dismiss the case as fictional. In 2005, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, wanting to distance themselves from the story, released a statement on their website claiming that the case of the disappearance is not true. As far as they were concerned, the story was an urban legend that originated in Frank Edwards' 1959 book. They asserted there is no evidence, however, to support such a story, and even went so far as to claim that a village existing in such a remote area was impossible. They ended their statement by stating that the mounted police who patrolled the area recorded no untoward events of any kind, and neither did local trappers or missionaries. And yet we know that the story was reported on by newspapers in November 1930. The Danville Bee's reprint of Emmett E. Keller's original story is easily accessible via online archives. Not only that, it is claimed that after the original Le Pas article was published, the RCMP received inquiries from members of the public, with Sergeant J. Nelson of the RCMP filing an internal report on the matter, which was released to the public in January 1931. And so an even bigger mystery has been born from the original incident. Why has the RCMP been so eager to discredit the case of the disappearing village? Whilst the precise details of November 1930 cannot be confirmed, with the reputation of both trapper Joe LaBelle and the reporter Keller being questioned by some researchers, to state that there are no records of either the disappearance or the village itself even having existed is a clear falsehood. Exactly what happened to the villagers at Lake Anjikuni? Was their disappearance somehow linked to the strange lights seen in the sky above the area at the time? And what does the RCMP know that they, like the existence of the village itself, are so enthusiastic to bury? On the 10th of July 1958, the RCS Melanesian was on a trip in the Solomon Islands in the Pacific Ocean. It was a relatively new vessel, having been launched from Hong Kong exactly 2 years previous. However, on that day something mysterious happened, with the ship never being heard from again. 64 people on board, not to mention the Melanesian itself, vanished without a trace. There were no distress calls from the ship, or any particular weather conditions that could have explained its sudden disappearance. 3 days after it failed to arrive at port, an extensive air and sea search for the ship began. Only a piece of timber, a damaged buoyancy tank, and part of a body were recovered. Upon discovery and analysis of these remnants, it was suspected that the Melanesian must have been destroyed quickly and violently. It could only be concluded that its demise must have been so rapid that those on board were not able to send out a distress signal. A court of inquiry was established in an attempt to discover the cause of the disaster. However, even after an extensive investigation, no cause could be determined. The ship, its crew, and passengers had simply disappeared. At the time, some believed it had run into a mine or had been torpedoed at sea. A loud bang was recorded as being heard in the vicinity of its route 2 days after its disappearance on the 12th of July at around 4 p.m. Some suggested that this noise may have been connected to its destruction. However, this explanation was dismissed by authorities. The sound and its source could not be verified, not to mention its occurrence being 2 days after the incident. The only reason given for the ship's destruction was an enormous, unidentifiable force. Something powerful, some suggested, had smashed into the vessel, utterly destroying it. For those with a belief in extraterrestrial involvement on Earth, such an explanation leaves open the possibility of an unidentified submerged or flying object being responsible. Others have argued that the Melanesian sank because of a rogue wave. Whatever the case, the truth is unknown. What is surprising, however, is that in the decades since, the case has not been abandoned by the authorities. As recently as 2019, more than 60 years after the tragedy, the Solomon Islands government called for a task force to solve the case of the RCS Melanesian, its disappearance simply too unnerving and too tragic to be forgotten. Granger Taylor was a genius. Born in 1948, he grew up on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, Canada, and was the definition of an autodidact. Despite a lack of formal education, having dropped out of school in the 8th grade, he was a mechanical prodigy, building a one-cylinder automobile at the age of just 14, before going on to restore a plethora of vehicles, including the rusted remains of an old steam locomotive that he hauled out from the forest in which it had been abandoned, as well as a vintage P-40 Kitty Hawk military fighter aircraft, the restored plane being purchased by a collector in 1981 for $20,000. In addition to trains and planes, talented Taylor had another mechanical interest, building a life-sized replica of a flying saucer. In the latter portion of the 1970s, Taylor dedicated the better part of a year to designing, constructing, and welding together a spaceship on his parents' property on the marshes of Simonis Lake using spare parts he had salvaged. The reason why? He claimed to have come into telepathic contact with an extraterrestrial being, after which he became obsessed with figuring out how spaceships were powered and if it was possible to build one. Taylor was gripped, and his unearthly interest no secret. Those who knew him at the time, who have spoken out about Taylor in the decades since, have described him as an eccentric genius who, whenever you would speak with him, would inevitably turn the conversation to talk of UFOs and aliens. After constructing the flying saucer, he was known to spend hours inside, sitting, thinking, often sleeping there. One of his friends, Robert Keller, who was interviewed for a Vice article decades later, explained that Taylor told him he had dreams that aliens were coming to get him. Another friend was told something similar, revealing to a local newspaper, Times columnist, that Taylor would go to his flying saucer to lie there and supposedly receive mental communications with somebody from another galaxy. He couldn't see them, they were just talking to him and his mind. His obsession reached a tragic peak when, on the night of the 29th of November 1980, 32-year-old Taylor walked out of his parents' home, leaving all of his worldly possessions behind, never to be seen again. Before he left, he wrote a strange note for his parents to find. In it, he explained he had gone away to walk aboard an alien spaceship. The aliens with whom he had been communicating via dreams, it seemed, had offered him a voyage to explore the vast universe. His parents, however, were not to worry, for Taylor wrote that the voyage would only last 42 months, after which he would then return. In the meantime, he was leaving behind all of his possessions to them, for he would no longer require the use of any. When writing the note, Taylor also altered his will, crossing out the word death and replacing it with departure. Peculiarly, a report by a local newspaper also claimed that on the reverse side of the handwritten note, he had drawn a contour map of Waterloo Mountain, a peak located some 20 miles west of the Taylor's property. What Taylor meant by including this map with his note is unknown. What is known, however, is that Granger Taylor did not return, neither immediately nor after the 42-month voyage period he mentioned in his note. The introspective, gentle genius, much loved by his friends and family, was gone, having disappeared without a trace. His family and the police spent months searching for him, but no one could uncover any leads as to where Taylor could be. Not only had he left all of his possessions behind, he had also abandoned $10,000, a sum of money which, in 1980, would have easily helped him to start over elsewhere, should it have been his intention to leave and begin a new chapter in his life. The only thing missing was his car, a 1972 Datsun pickup. His parents kept his room untouched, hoping one day their son would return. Then, in March 1986, local forestry workers reported a lead. They had found the wreckage of a vehicle somewhere near British Columbia's Mount Prevost, not far from the Taylor family home. The truck, identified as a Datsun pickup, had been blown to pieces by dynamite. Bone fragments were also said to have been found at the scene, and so it seemed as if Taylor had been found. It was said that through the use of dynamite, he had taken his own life. And yet what followed were conflicting reports. While some claim that the police were able to match the vehicle identification number on the wreckage to Taylor's pickup, others have argued that there was a confusion as to the specifics of the vehicle, with some claiming Taylor drove a bright pink truck and others saying it was pale blue. And then there were other reports that threw doubt on whether or not a vehicle was even found, with it being said that the logger actually discovered a crater in the ground and metal debris embedded in a tree, and that there was no indication that the debris belonged to a vehicle. Whatever the reality, the strongest argument against Taylor ending his own life is said to be the note he left his parents. Known as a considerate young man who got on well with his parents, it is difficult to imagine him performing an unnecessarily cruel hoax that was intended to leave those he left behind perplexed and hoping for his return 42 months later. What was the reasoning? Unless, of course, the explosion had been accidental, and that he had, as his note suggested, been on his way to meet with so-called extraterrestrials when his truck blew up. It is impossible to say. Even the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who were involved in the search for Taylor and the later discovery of the wreckage, have been unclear as to whether or not the bone fragments allegedly found at the site were Taylor's. A newspaper article dating from the time, published by the Montreal Gazette, claimed that 2 pieces of bone were found at the blast site, and the pathologist confirmed they are human. They were not, however, confirmed as Taylor's, with the RCMP stating that they were working on the assumption that they belonged to the missing man. It is not known if it was later confirmed whether or not they were his remains. And so many have been left unsatisfied. What really happened to Granger Taylor? Did mental illness and an unhealthy obsession with flying saucers cause Taylor to suffer a breakdown, one which eventually led to him taking his own life? Or was he really in contact with extraterrestrial beings, the destroyed truck either being unrelated to his disappearance or a way for Taylor to dispose of his vehicle before he left Earth? A curious side note in this case is that the area in which the mystery occurred was no stranger to UFO sightings. Just a decade earlier, on New Year's Eve 1969, a nurse by the name of Doreen Kendall reported seeing, along with 3 other nurses, a Saturn-shaped UFO with 2 humanoid occupants hovering outside the window of the hospital where she was working. Decades later, Taylor's disappearance continues to affect the people he left behind. Not just his family, but the friends he gained as a mentor and genius of mechanical anthropology. Without a doubt, he was an uncannily brilliant, bright young man, and so, according to Tyler Hooper, a consultant who researched Taylor for a 2019 CBC documentary dedicated to him and his mysterious disappearance called Spaceman, if anyone could find a way to travel to another world beyond the cosmos, it would have been Granger Taylor. Frederick Paul Valentich was a young Australian pilot with limited experience. In 1978, he was 20 years old, had 150 flight hours, and had received a Class 4 instrument rating that year, which allowed him to fly at night. On the evening of the 21st of October 1978, he was eager to go flying. It was a perfect day to be in the air, sunny weather and light winds which should have given no trouble for his planned couple-of-hour trip between Melbourne, Australia and King Island. And so at around 5 p.m. that day, he received a briefing on meteorological conditions for Moorabbin Airport in Melbourne and submitted his flight plan at 5:23. Less than an hour later, his Cessna 182 plane was fueled and in the air, heading towards King Island. Soon after his departure, he established two-way communication between his plane and the Melbourne Flight Service Unit, the FSU, at the control tower. At 7:06 p.m, what should have been a routine flight took a strange turn, with a series of communications between Valentich and FSU laying the foundation for one of the most mysterious events of all time. According to the report released by the Australian government some 3 decades later, in 2010, Valentich began by asking the control tower whether there was any known traffic below 5,000 feet, to which they replied, no known traffic. Despite there being no aircraft on record in the area, Valentich described seeing a craft with 4 bright, possibly landing lights underneath it. He further described the unknown craft as being at least 1,000 feet above him. When asked by the control tower if it was a large aircraft, the report states that he responded by saying its size was unknown due to the speed it was travelling, after which Valentich asked if there was any Air Force aircraft in the vicinity. Those at control reaffirmed there was no known aircraft in the area. What Valentich alleged to be seeing was not on record. Valentich then reported the craft was approaching him from the east. Precisely 21 seconds later, he reported that he's playing some sort of game, and then described how the unidentified aircraft was flying over him 2-3 times at a time, travelling at a speed he could not identify. What Valentich was reporting was exceptional, and FSU was perplexed. The dialogue then goes on to detail further specifics, with Valentich stating he was at 4,500 feet and could not identify the aircraft. Then, at 7:09, Valentich stated that what he was seeing was not an aircraft. He went on to say, "It is," but trailed off before he was able to complete his sentence. Control tower then asked him to describe the craft in more detail. Valentich reported it had a long shape, but that he could not tell much more as it was travelling so fast. It was then that his report became ominous. He claimed that it was before me right now, and that he was able to better describe what he was seeing. According to Valentich, the unidentified craft was sort of metallic, shiny, and had a green light. As he observed it from his plane, it was right on top of him, following him as he flew. Then the object just vanished. A second later, and Valentich reported that it had returned and was visible once more, the object now approaching him from the southwest. It was at this point that he began to report engine trouble from his Cessna aircraft. Control tower responded by asking for his intentions, and the young pilot described how he was heading towards King Island, before stating that the unknown aircraft was hovering on top of him. It seemed as though he was being pursued. Seconds later, and Valentich said, "It's hovering, and it's not an aircraft." These were the last words ever heard from Frederick Valentich. The microphone is reported as having remained open for some time afterward, with metallic scraping sounds being heard by FSU until it completely cut out. Aircraft were scrambled to search for Valentich soon afterwards, to no avail. Soon after he went missing, a flurry of opinions started to be constructed as to what had happened to the young pilot. As such, in the decades since, it is a case that has been studied extensively and has left people divided. Eager to offer a rational explanation for an otherwise mysterious incident, skeptical arguments dismiss the case entirely, stating that Valentich's disappearance was a result of his own actions and does not merit further investigation. It has been said that he was not a good pilot, having failed examinations to get professional qualifications for flying, and was even under consideration for prosecution at the time for having deliberately flown into a cloud twice. Valentich's character, according to skeptics, meant he could not be trusted as an eyewitness, and that anything he claimed he saw was not so. Rather, his disappearance was an elaborate way for him to end his own life, or for him to disappear and start a new one. In short, there was nothing mysterious about what had happened that evening. And indeed, it is impossible for us to know precisely what was going through Valentich's mind at the time. And yet, the points put forward by skeptics can be said to make no sense, being extrapolated from the most minuscule scraps of evidence and riddled with logical fallacies. One of the main points that skeptics have put forward is that Valentich was a UFO enthusiast, and that him reporting seeing an unidentified craft before disappearing was awfully convenient. Having already discredited his character, some skeptics have suggested that Valentich orchestrated a UFO scenario to either end his life or disappear. Others point to him having filled the tank of his plane with petrol, stating that he must have planned to disappear as his intended journey did not require so much fuel, and therefore anything he claimed he saw in the skies that evening was all a part of his elaborate plan. And yet, such premeditation goes against the character assessment put forward by those eager to dismiss the case. In one breath, Valentich is discredited as a misfit failure, unable to pass exams or take responsibility for his own actions. In the next breath, the same skeptics credit him as being creative and competent enough to construct an elaborate scheme which has fooled many. Furthermore, if Valentich really did want to construct a UFO scenario, as has been claimed, why did he never refer to the object he saw as such? In attempting to present a sensible explanation, those with a skeptical mindset have done anything but. Not only this, those who knew Valentich, including doctors and colleagues who spoke on the record after his disappearance, eliminated the possibility of him wanting to end his own life. It was simply not in his character. One of the most objective skeptical arguments for his disappearance can be said to be that which claims Valentich became disoriented. We know he was having engine problems, albeit after the initial sighting, and so it has been argued that his plane went upside down, which resulted in him crashing into the sea. The lights he claimed he saw either being his own plane, reflecting in the water, or natural light emitted from a planet such as Venus. Once again, however, there are issues with this skeptical argument. Aviation authorities have dismissed the possibility, as the Cessna 182's design makes prolonged inverted flight impossible. And so Valentich's disappearance cannot be easily explained. Not only that, those who clung to the notion that he fueled his plane for a long-distance journey, planning on an elaborate disappearance, were thoroughly disproven in 1983, when what was thought to be part of the wreckage of the plane was recovered. And so, what happened? In the years since the incident, an impressive catalogue of information has been compiled by both government officials and UFOologists who claim that there may have been extraterrestrial interference in Valentich's fateful flight. One of the most impressive pieces of evidence for what Valentich saw being a UFO has come from Roy Manifold, a plumber who had set up a time-lapse that same evening to photograph the sun setting over the water. When he developed the photographs, he was shocked. They seemed to show a fast-moving object exiting the water near Cape Otway Lighthouse, near Valentich's flight route at around 6:47 p.m, a mere 20 minutes before Valentich reported his strange encounter. Manifold's photographs have been studied extensively by independent experts, one of them being Dr. Richard F. Haynes, a former NASA researcher who concluded the images represent a bona fide unknown flying object. Upon further study of the photographs in the series, it was further speculated that the object was travelling around 200 miles an hour. Some skeptics have dismissed this explanation, describing the object as cloud formations, without trying to explain how a cloud could have been travelling at such a high speed. Dr. Haynes, his interest in the case piqued, was also given access to the audio of the radio conversation for analysis. He was especially interested by the sounds at the end, after the young pilot's last words. According to his report, there were 36 separate bursts with fairly constant start and stop pulses bounding each one. He also said there were no discernible patterns in time or frequency, thus emphasizing the strange nature of the sounds. He could offer no explanation. After the incident, many in the area reported seeing strange objects in the sky. One person even reported seeing an erratically moving green light, reminiscent of Valentich's own description of the unknown aircraft. What makes this case even more enigmatic is the fact that Valentich's disappearance, whilst extraordinary, is not unique. He disappeared over an area known as the Bass Strait Triangle, and has thus joined a catalogue of mysterious disappearances that have occurred in that area, from a British warship and its crew of over 100 people in 1858 to several bomber planes in the 1940s. The Bass Strait Triangle holds many mysteries, with convincing explanations difficult to find. Tragically, the case of Frederick Valentich has become just another mysterious incident to be reported in the area. Thank you so much for watching, and also an extra special thank you to our members, both here on YouTube and on Patreon. If you enjoyed this, be sure to like and subscribe for more of the paranormal. You can also sign up to my newsletter on paranormalscholar.com to be notified of new content. And if you cannot wait until my next video, why not watch the one suggested on the screen now? Until next time.